Welcome to the American Chronicles podcast. I'm Vlad Davidiuk. Dr. Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, spoke with members of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston on February 16, 2017, offering a profound and timely examination of a world increasingly defined by disorder, as a new administration takes office and as President Obama's foreign policy legacy is assessed and discussed. Dr. Haass also presented his new book, A World in Disarray, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis of the Old Order, a lucid and incisive analysis of our shifting landscape and the need for a new American foreign policy. This program includes excerpts of his remarks. Coming up next on the American Chronicles.
I'm delighted to have as our moderator Clifford Krauss. He is the National Energy Business Correspondent for the New York Times, and I'm happy to say he's based here in Houston. He was previously the bureau chief for the Times Buenos Aires and also Toronto bureaus. He's reported extensively from the Middle East and North Africa. Krauss has also covered the State Department, Congress, and the New York City Police Department. He also worked as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and was an Edward R. Murrow Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has published numerous articles in Foreign Affairs, GQ, and Wilson Quarterly, among other publications, and is the author of the acclaimed book, Inside Central America. And our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Richard Haass, is in his 14th year as president on the Council on Foreign Relations. It's an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution that is dedicated to helping people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices facing the United States and other countries. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was a Director of Policy Planning for the Department of State, where he's a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass also served as U.S. coordinator for policy towards the future of Afghanistan and also U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland peace process. In recognition of his service, he's received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award. His latest and acclaimed book, I have it right here, an excellent book, which I highly recommend, is called The World in Disarray, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis of the Old Order. It'll be available for purchase and for signing after the program. And just so you know, out there, we'll have one line in this kind of back corner for purchasing the book. And if you already bought the book, you can get in the line to have them sign it afterwards. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Haass and Clifford Krauss to the Wall Street Journal.
Okay, Richard, let's get started. This is really an extraordinary book, and I'm putting it in my bookshelf next to Kissinger's World Order. And but as extraordinary as the book is, the title of the book couldn't be better, A World in Disarray. We have disarray around the world for sure. We seem to have some disarray in Washington at the moment. We have threats. We have threats from Russia right now, from North Korea. How did we get to this point?
First of all, it's great to be back in Houston. And it's clearly a slow night in Houston. Explains why so many people are here. This is the book. This book is a book about disarray. It was a word that was chosen advisedly. It somewhere falls between what is desirable, which is order and structure, and at the other extreme, chaos and anarchy, and it's somewhere in between. Unfortunately, it's moving in the wrong direction, both internationally and domestically, and the two are very much related. We'll probably talk about that a little bit more. How we got here? It's best to think of it in three different categories of reasons. One is what academics like me would call structural reasons. This is everything, the rise of certain powers, the Chinas and others. It's in part because of globalization. All these things that move in great volume and great speed across borders, from terrorists to viruses, whether they're the computer type or the biological type, to guns, to drugs, to greenhouse gases, to dollars, you name it. Whatever they are, governments aren't very good at managing or controlling these flows. We've also seen we got a world where there's more and more capacity, the ability to make a real difference in more and more hands. This is not a world controlled by a couple of governments anymore. Power is much more dispersed. You've got these phenomena, plus you had things like the end of the Cold War. And when that ended, you lost a lot of the discipline that the United States and Soviets introduced into international relations to make sure that things didn't get out of hand and bring into play their nuclear arsenal. So that's one set of reasons. Second of all, though, the United States has made things in some ways worse by things it's done. And I would call those the acts of commission. And just a couple I would list, just to show I'm bipartisan, I would say it's the decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003, the decision more recently to invade Libya, the decision by President Obama after things had restabilized in Iraq to take U.S. forces out, which once again led to an unraveling. Decision to put U.S. forces in Afghanistan on a schedule to leave, not based on conditions, but based on an arbitrary calendar. More recently, the decision to kill the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, and which raised major questions about American reliability. And then there's acts of omission. And there I would put at the top of the list probably a series of decisions in Syria by President Obama, the most famous or infamous being the Red Line decision after the Syrians used chemical weapons, not to follow up the Libya invasion. So if you take this combination of broad historical trends, plus things the United States decided to do and not do, I think that essentially explains why we have a world of disarray.
So when we had the Cold War, which was a nervous time, we had these two superpowers, and there was a detente, there was an understanding between the United States and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's gone, and we have Russia. And it seems that the new president wants to have a new relationship with Russia, and perhaps he's looking at the good old days of the Cold War. Maybe a better relationship with Russia would be stable, would stabilize or help stabilize the Middle East and Eastern Europe. What is wrong with that thinking?
Well, again, the purpose of the relationship with any country is not to have happy relations. It's not to have smooth relations per se. It's to have a relationship that is objectively better because it reflects the behavior of the other side. So our goal with Russia is not to be friends as an end in itself, but rather it's to see Russian behavior change in ways that we would deem desirable that would allow a more positive relationship to result. This would be very different. Mr. Putin has shown his willingness to use force and violate some of the most fundamental rules of the world, of international relations. He did it in Ukraine, in his takeover of Crimea, violated the basic concept of sovereignty. He continues to support all sorts of instability in eastern Ukraine. And then what he did in Syria, supporting a violent government, and essentially committed all sorts of war crimes. So we should have no illusions about Mr. Putin. And the fact also that Mr. Putin essentially operates without checks and balances ought to give us pause. He has deinstitutionalized decision-making in his country. A lot of you, I look around the room, you're of my generation, a few years older, a few years younger, but we all remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, let me just say that Vladimir Putin has greater latitude and discretion to do what he wants than Nikita Khrushchev had at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because Nikita Khrushchev, he had to deal with the Politburo and all that. Vladimir Putin doesn't have to deal with anything. If tomorrow he wants to invade a NATO country, I don't believe there's anyone in Russia who could stop him. So I think that's what we're up against. So I think on one hand, we've got to get prescriptive for a moment. We've got to be tougher, and I think that means strengthening NATO. NATO was in many ways demilitarized with the end of the Cold War. We have to, I believe, give Ukraine some ability to take care of its own defense. I believe selectively we might need to become a little bit more assertive in the Middle East. Bottom line is we can't depend upon Mr. Putin's any self-restraint. On the other hand, our goal should not be to isolate or humiliate Russia. If we can talk and we can have constructive dealings, whether about stability in Europe, what we used to call arms control relationships, dealing with nuclear forces, how to deal with terrorism, how to deal with North Korea, that would be great. And we should basically say, among other things, we'd be prepared to ease sanctions selectively if you were to either start doing some things or stop doing other things. Basically, we ought to set up a conditional relationship with Russia.
So the administration seems to be challenged right now by Russia, by Korea, North Korea, that is. What does the administration do to show toughness but pragmatism?
Well, in the case of Russia, just to finish that conversation, we would push back, among other things, against interference in Western democracies. So we would make it clear, not only do they never need to stop and never do again what they did here to try to manipulate our politics, but not to do things in France or Germany, both of whom face major elections. We'd also, though, perhaps show some diplomatic restraint ourselves. We wouldn't necessarily spend our time lecturing the Russians publicly about their own lack of democracy. We wouldn't necessarily expand or enlarge NATO to include countries like Ukraine or Georgia. So we would show a mixture, again, of firmness and restraint. And I think that's basically a model for other countries. And we can talk, whichever ones about China. China's a very different kettle of fish. China's a much more integrated country, unlike Russia, which is something of a spoiler and really doesn't see much value in the current state of the world. The Chinese do. They benefited from it tremendously, if one looks at the economic trajectory in that country. So I think China, in some ways, is a more important country, but also one where I think there's more upside in the relationship. And I think the administration started off terribly by questioning the basics of the U.S.-China relationship, the so-called one China policy that had worked for 45 years. I think it discovered the error of its ways, and it has taken that off the table for the time being. And to me, hopefully we won't have a massive trade altercation with China, which I think could and should be avoided. What I want to do with China is clear the decks. So the priority for U.S.-Chinese relations can be to deal with what I think is emerging as perhaps the biggest national security threat of the next few years, which is North Korea. Somewhere over the next couple of years, North Korea will be able to put a couple of nuclear warheads on missiles that can reach the continental United States. That is not a situation I relish, to say the least, that we would have to depend upon either deterrence or missile defense or North Korea's own restraint. So the best way I know of heading it off without having to contemplate military force on our part would be that the Chinese would use the leverage they have, that they say they don't have, but in fact they do, because they are the principal economic supporters of North Korea. And so again, I want to, in foreign policy, like anything else in life, you've got to choose your priorities. Mr. Trump inherited what I would think, today he said he inherited a mess. I think that exaggerates it, badly exaggerates it domestically, somewhat exaggerates it internationally, but he did inherit what I would call a world of disarray. He did inherit a daunting inbox. If you think about it, what we just talked about in Asia, we talked about in Europe with Russia, other problems in Europe with Brexit, refugees, what have you. We could spend the entire night talking about the bucket of problems in the Middle East. So he's inherited a daunting, again, inbox. And what he needs to therefore do is decide, what his priorities are. And I've been basically arguing publicly and privately that there's enough real problems coming at us that the administration shouldn't do things to add to the inbox. I know everybody in life likes a challenge. They've got enough of one. Every once in a while, just be content with what you have.
Richard, I need a stronger drink. What I'm hearing is we have all of these issues to deal with, and certainly in the last administration seemed to be more reactive than having a grand vision. There was some vision, but in your book you mentioned how there was the tilt to Asia, but it was impartial. It was only a partial tilt. What is this a time to have a grand strategy in the world?
I'd say two things. I think for the previous administration, I agree with you. Their big idea was to, in some ways, dial down what the United States was doing in the greater Middle East and dial up what we're doing in Asia. And as a first approximation, that's a good idea. I would essentially argue that we've allowed the Middle East to absorb too high a percentage of our calories over the last 15 years. And Asia is where the 21st century, most of its history is going to be written. China, India, Japan, these are the great economies. This is, again, the center of gravity. In some ways, Europe was the center of gravity for much of the 20th century. Asia will be the center of global gravity for the 21st century. The Obama administration never quite succeeded or completed this pivot or rebalance. I think, though, the bigger idea of the Obama administration was also where I began, was dialing down in the Middle East. And President Obama was committed to dramatically reducing U.S. military presence in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and in some ways unconditionally. And that got him into trouble. And he clearly falls into the school or category of American presidents who want to reduce America's footprint in the world. You know, the fancy word is retrenchment, and he was a retrencher. And I think history will be somewhat critical of how he went about it. Indeed, I think history will be very critical, particularly in places like Syria, where, again, his acts of omission, I believe, will loom large historically. Do we need a vision now? Yeah, you need a vision in general. Let me just sort of say, there's so many things that come at you. I've worked for 4 presidents, and I worked at the White House for one of them, my favorite president, George Herbert Walker Bush. And, local also, yes. A son of Houston, as we sit here. Just a wonderful man, and I think, again, I think history, his reputation will only grow historically. But my point is simply that there's so many things coming at you so fast that you need some way to sort them. If every day you wake up and you see what's come in, it's very hard to make determined priorities, very hard to decide what you put to the side. There's a danger, as anyone in business knows, that the urgent crowds out the important. So there's something to be said for having a strategy. It's also a way of signaling to Americans what it is that we're going to be called upon to do. It's a way to reassure allies. It's a way to deter and warn would-be or actual foes. It helps you determine where to put down really large, long-term investments. What kind of a military do we need? Because a lot of the decisions you make are 50-year decisions. So yeah, to do all this without a strategy, without a compass, is a very difficult thing. I would say for this era of history, the principal idea ought to be, how do we manage globalization? And we live in a world, think about it, where nothing stays local for long. If there's a hacker in some other country, they can cause tremendous harm here. If a disease outbreak happens somewhere, whether it's Ebola or Zika or some strong influenza, it could cause a tremendous loss of life here. If nuclear weapons spread around the world, if refugees spread around the world, if greenhouse gases spread around, all these things could have tremendous consequences. So my argument is we need to start talking to other countries about how we build what I call World Order 2.0, rather than just basing it on sovereignty, which is necessary but no longer sufficient. What we should basically say is, we're going to continue to have the rule that nobody invades other countries, but we've now got to take into account the fact that virtually nothing stays local for long, and that sovereign countries like our own have to increasingly monitor and regulate those things which take place in their country, which could have adverse consequences for others. So we have to do it, because you just can't talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk, but we need to urge others to do it too. We need to incentivize them to do it, and we also have to be prepared to penalize them if they don't do it. But essentially, if we don't do that, we and others will be overwhelmed, what I think, by the dark side of globalization, from terrorism to chaos in cyberspace, to disease, to proliferation, to climate change. And we've got to take this approach not as an act of philanthropy to the world, but essentially as an act of self-interest. Again, what happens out there will fundamentally affect the quality of life, our prosperity and security here. So we can't have, try not to get direct about it, a narrow America first foreign policy. We need to understand that what happens in the world will affect the fundamental quality of life here in America.
So what happens if, when you talk about cyberspace, in the last election, we'll never know how significant it was or the impact, but there was Russian interference in our democratic system. This is a fundamental attack on the United States. And how do we respond to that? It's arguably an act of war, although it is not. It is belligerent. And how do we respond to something like that without it escalating into a state of war?
Well, I mean, there's no clear playbook for this. The analogy I use for things cyber, it reminds me of the old Wild West. There's lots of people running around with guns, there's not much in the way of a sheriff or law. And that's kind of what cyberspace is. It's this new technology that we haven't set up the rules for, much less the enforcement. So there's no playbook. So the answer is we should feel compelled to respond, because this is not the kind of behavior you want to see repeated or encouraged. Now, how you respond, though, any number of, you could respond in kind. You could say, well, we're going to do things with cyber against them. That's one option. But we need to remember that at the end of the day, even though we have lots of cyber offensive tools, we are very cyber dependent as an advanced modern society. Our economy, our military, our way of life. So we don't necessarily want to reinforce the wild and westness of it all. So that's an option, but it's not necessarily one. It might be sanctions. You might think about that. You might simply tell Putin, well, this is, one of the things we're going to do because of what you did is we're going to go ahead and reintroduce military forces at a faster or greater level to some of your neighbors. Essentially, we should respond in ways that make sense for us. But we shouldn't feel compelled to necessarily respond in kind. And we should begin the conversation or continue the conversation with the Russians and others about what are the rules of cyberspace. We do not want this to become the new normal. And so we should push back hard against it.
So this administration doesn't seem to recognize the problem at this point. Now the Congress, that there was an intervention in our election, I'm not sure that the president has directly addressed that issue. Members of Congress have, the intelligence community has. What happens if we do not respond in some way to this?
Well, again, the danger is if we don't respond, is that if others conclude that there's no penalty for certain types of what I would consider to be unacceptable behavior, they're likely to continue it. So we want to make sure that the Russians think twice or three times before they can do the same thing in France and Germany this year, given the critical elections there. We want to make sure they never do it again to the United States. And we don't want others to copycat it. So yeah, I think it's important that we introduce a serious response. And if the president isn't going to do it, then Congress has certain options. But it's important, again, nothing is self-regulating. I think, a lot of us took Economics 101, and you learn when you take Economics 101 the Adam Smith idea of the perfect market and the invisible hand, and everything just works great and profits get maximized. In my experience, let's put aside the accuracy of that for contemporary economics. Nothing in geopolitics works that way. Things just don't sort themselves out by themselves. It takes very visible hands rather than invisible hands. And most often it takes a fairly visible, active role of the United States. So we shouldn't think if we do less, others will say, oh, okay, well then we're just going to act, we're going to copy you and be responsible as well. It tends not to work that way.
There's so much news right now. I feel like I wanted to come back to the Middle East a little bit and Israel and the Palestinian issue. Because the president the other day seemed to veer a bit off of what has been the traditional policy of the United States, which is to support a two-state solution. Is there a one-state solution?
Well, if there were to be a one-state, quote-unquote, solution, it would be consequential. Because given the demographics, ultimately that one state would no longer be a Jewish one, and it might not, or a democratic one, given the history and culture of that part of the world, and it might not be a viable one. So if you believe that there should be a state of Israel, and the state of Israel, I believe, has four characteristics that must be sustained. It must be Jewish, democratic, prosperous, and secure. Then I think that argues for a two-state solution. So I think it's an Israeli self-interest. Again, not as an act of philanthropy towards Palestinians, but as an act of self-interest for itself to have a two-state solution is the best way I know to lock in the core essentials of the state of Israel. Now, having said that, I'm not going to sit here and say that the situation is poised to have a two-state solution. It's not. I years and years ago wrote a book about the idea of ripeness, R-I-P-E-N-E-S-S, and essentially said there have to be certain prerequisites for any negotiation to be resolved. And among other things, besides a formula and a process, what you really need is leadership on the various sides that's willing and able to make the necessary compromises for peace. Well, the Middle East has a lot of things. What it does not have on the Israeli-Palestinian side is leaderships that are willing and able to make the necessary compromises for peace. So that there's not going to be a two-state solution anytime soon, but I think it's important to preserve it. It's also important to do or not do things that could make a bad situation worse. I don't, for example, and I'm glad the administration's held off on this, I don't want to see the United States move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I think that could spark all sorts of riots and violence in Jerusalem. And anytime there's serious violence in Jerusalem, it gets incredibly dangerous. Because if we ever wake up one day and there's violence to the holy places in Jerusalem, that will have global consequences. That will be viral in terrible ways. So my view is keep alive the possibility for a two-state solution. Again, I think Israelis have to understand why it's in their own self-interest to ultimately move in that direction. The United States can't force them. And in the meantime, keep bad situations from getting worse, because that's always possible. And that ought to be, so I don't think this ought to be the centerpiece of what we do in the region.
So we stay at it. Just stay
But stay at it at a low level. If I were advising Rex Tillerson, I would say this ought not to be a big chunk of what you do. Prospects for the poor. And just to be really, really realistic here, imagine tomorrow there were an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. It wouldn't affect the Iranian nuclear program. It wouldn't affect Iran's push for regional primacy. It wouldn't affect what's going on in Syria or Libya or Yemen or Lebanon or anywhere else. So it doesn't hold the key to the region. We call it the Middle East peace process. It's not. It's the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. It'd be very important to Israelis and Palestinians, don't get me wrong. But I don't think at the moment it holds somehow a key to that what's the most turbulent part of the world. And again, as John Kerry learned and others, you can give it 100% of your time, but you won't have the results in any way to show for it.
Right. We're in Houston, so we really should talk about energy a little bit. Obviously, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've had a revolution. Arguably, Houston is the center of it, of fracking and this just explosion of domestic production. It's changed our economy.
People are dressed much better than 3-4 years ago when I was last there. Go Houston, I can say it.
Not as well as 2 years ago.
There you go.
But things are coming back. But anyway, so maybe you could explain to us what this means for U.S. foreign policy, or to mean, you were talking about dialing back on the Middle East. How much less do we care about potential instability in a Saudi Arabia or a Venezuela or any of these oil states?
The answer is not a whole lot less. And one of the phrases that ought to be banned from the lexicon is energy independence. It's not simply that we still import some 4 million barrels a day of oil because there's a mismatch between what we produce and what we refine. But even the United States is not economically independent from the rest of the world. And to the extent that the rest of the world depends upon Middle Eastern oil, we're not economically independent of it. So there's that. So stability in places like Saudi Arabia, which still produce, 1 out of every 9 or 10 or so barrels in the world, still matters. Plus, we were just talking about Israel. The United States has a special relationship with and responsibility to Israel. Plus, we've seen when there's instability in the Middle East, there's humanitarian crises that flow from it. Look at the impact of refugees on Europe. More than anything else, it's the flow of refugees from the Middle East that has fundamentally changed the politics of Europe, putting in jeopardy the entire European project that has brought unprecedented peace and stability to Europe since World War II. There's all the terrorism that emanates from the Middle East, either physically or over the internet. You could have proliferation. So the United States has all sorts of interests in the Middle East, so we can't walk away from, we shouldn't walk away from, or try to wash our hands of the world. That said, our position in energy has given us a considerable cushion. And it means that we've got the ability to absorb, in some ways, a degree of geopolitical instability, whether it's Venezuela or Nigeria or something in the Middle East. But we can't, though, make ourselves independent of events in the Middle East.
We're going to take a few questions, but I have one last question for you, and it's a crazy thought, premised on the following: the United States has a 5th fleet. I believe it's the 5th fleet protecting the Persian Gulf. so much of that oil is going to India and particularly China. China now is dependent on the Persian Gulf, and we are not. But we are basically defending supply lines for China and its energy needs. Why not share the defense of those waters with the Chinese, and we would have a strategic alliance based on energy and the economic needs of China, Asia, and indirectly the United States?
I'm not against, by any means, the Chinese or Indians and others playing a larger stabilizing role in that part of the world. I don't think our purpose is to keep them out. We have to remember, though, that our military presence in that part of the world, again, has many other purposes other than simply keeping stability in oil-producing areas. And ironically enough, if there were major instability in Saudi Arabia, depending upon the nature of the instability, it's not clear that American military forces would have all that much of a role. So it's one thing to use American military forces against an external invader. That I get. Something qualitatively different to use it against an internal resurrection.
But to protect the Gulf itself, the waterway.
It's in our self-interest that it happens, and we should get if we can get others who have an interest in it to sign up, fine. But in the meantime, it's useful, again, given the global economy. And I think we also have to understand that the Chinese and others, when they do get involved in stability in other countries, they often do it on terms that we would find narrowly apolitical. They are willing to cut deals with countries we're not often or always willing to cut deals with. So when others play a larger role, with it comes a greater degree of influence. So you've got to trade that off. So
we have some questions.
Yes, sir.
NAFTA in Mexico. Then the question here is, will rewriting NAFTA hurting Mexico's economy result in even more illegal immigration?
Okay, that's lots bundled in there. I mean, the idea of modernizing NAFTA in and of itself is a good idea. NAFTA is now, 23 years old, and there's issues that didn't even exist 23 years ago. So like any other agreement, it has to be adapted and modernized. That's good. But we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. This has worked, I think, extraordinarily well for the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Let me just say that by and large, the trade debate in this country is a debate not based upon facts or reality. Most of the job loss in the United States, the overwhelming percentage of the job loss in the United States, north of 80%, has not come from trade, has come from modernization and innovation and productivity increases. So we can rail against it all we want. We can scapegoat trade and we can scapegoat immigrants, but we're kidding ourselves. And we've got to have a serious conversation in this country about how we are going to deal with the relentless pace of innovation. Driverless vehicles, robotics, AI, let's get serious about that. If we think killing the Trans-Pacific Partnership or tearing up trade agreements with Mexico is going to solve our problems, that is dangerous. Because, let me say one other thing about two or three other, very quickly about Mexico. One is we have to be really careful. If we weaken Mexico's economy by tearing up or dismantling big chunks of NAFTA, right now there's a net outflow. It's emigration from the United States to Mexico. We will turn that around. So one of the bizarre things of this administration's policy, which claims to be so concerned about pressures coming from Mexico, which no longer exist because of NAFTA, if we destroy NAFTA, we are going to resurrect those kinds of pressures. Plus, we are running a real risk, and I'll be careful, but I think it's a real risk of making the next president of Mexico, Mr. López Obrador, who is a populist, who, if his economic policies ever become Mexico's economic policies, that will wreck Mexico's economy. And again, that will create tremendous immigration pressures here. So I think we've got to be very, very careful about the political and economic repercussions of a confrontational problem of policy towards Mexico.
It's interesting. We're getting a lot of... You can see Houston as a trade center. And here's another question on trade about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think this feeds right into your point. Okay. And the questioner, is asking if the action of basically removing the United States from that partnership if we allow China to become more of a leader of the economy of Asia?
Well, ditching the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which for those, is an agreement with, what was it, 11 or 12 countries, roughly 40 to 45% of the world's GDP, made no sense. It made no sense economically. It would have contributed modestly to American economic growth. It wasn't a perfect agreement, but it would have raised the standards of trade agreements. Right now, our tariff are lower than others, so we would have gained because the tariffs of other countries would have come closer to ours. Plus, strategically, not going ahead with it is exactly the reason that there's so much disarray in the world. Because what it does is it raises fundamental questions of American predictability and reliability. And if others are going to base their futures on us, and we suddenly start becoming a mercurial, unpredictable, unreliable country, one of two things are going to happen in the world. Either they're going to start appeasing powerful local states, Russia in Europe and Iran in the Middle East, to China in Asia, or they're going to start taking matters into their own hands and, for example, maybe saying, well, we can no longer rely on the American security guarantee. Maybe we need nuclear weapons of our own. Neither one of those futures is good for the world or good for the United States. So I actually think the strategic consequences of ditching TPP were greater than the economic consequences, but the economic consequences were plenty large enough as well.
It was a gift, wasn't it? I mean,
for China, yeah.
It was a gift because we have the open doors. This would have opened the doors for our goods abroad. So we were basically shooting ourselves in the foot. Editorial comment.
But also, you're allowed to, you're a journalist. And then but also the whole idea was to set, China was not a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The idea was to set the standards here, not here, but here. And then China, if it wanted to join, and it would have been felt the pressure to join, would have had to raise its game and live up to or sign up to a more stringent set of rules. Instead, China will now be setting the regional rules. It will be set lower, and that is not good for us or anybody else.
You must be reading the questions before I do.
It's like Karnak. It's the old thing on Johnny Carson.
I mean, it's like the title of your book. What can I say? President Trump believes unpredictability is an asset in foreign policy. What role, if any, can unpredictability play in the establishment of a stable world order? Too bad President Nixon is not here to answer that question, but you can try.
Look, I think unpredictability can sometimes be helpful as a tactic, particularly with foes. There's a whole debate in the academic literature about how do you deter or discourage enemies from doing bad things. And there is one school of thought that, yes, you should say, if you do X, we will do Y. Another school of thought is if you do X, you don't know what we're going to do, but you introduce a degree of uncertainty and you hope to deter or influence through uncertainty. So you can argue that on occasion whether it makes sense. But it's fundamentally different with friends and allies. You don't, because they're the ones who depend on you. They've thrown in their lot with you. That requires dependability and reliability. If they wake up and say, we can't count on the United States, they're going to then, as I said before, either have to take matters into their own hands or defer to powerful local states. You've also got to be very careful when you're unpredictable that you choose the right issues. And I'll give you one example, which...
Australia. Just kidding.
Well, Australia was unpredictability of a different sort. That was, with China. You don't choose to change policies on issues that matter more to the other side. For China, particularly this year, what's happening this year in China? This October is the 19th Party Congress. For Xi Jinping, this is his moment. This is the moment, this October, where he locks in the standing committee of his Politburo for at least the next 5 years. This is a way he can then build a political structure that will allow him to do what he wants to do. There is zero chance, not 0.001 chance, 0% chance that he can compromise on what is the most loaded, neuralgic, politicized issue in China, which is the integrity of the country, which is what Taiwan is all about. So the idea that we would try to send a message on that issue was doomed to fail, because at the end of the day, it matters much more to China than it does to us or even Taiwan at this point. So if you're going to be unpredictable, choose it, yes, with your foes, but choose it on those issues where tactically you are persuaded it might work. But it should never be introduced with your friends and allies.
Right. And if Beijing says call Taiwan next time you have a problem with North Korea, that's not going to work very well.
Exactly right. Plus, the last I checked, Taiwan's done pretty well from the current state of affairs. It's a thriving economy. It's a strong democracy. Again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's enough in this world that's broke that we've got to fix. We don't have to go around looking for new stuff.
So when the unpredictability is a tactic as opposed to a strategy. Is there an emerging Trump doctrine, or does it appear that he is just winging it?
Well, I think there is elements of it. And every once in a while, one should read carefully what people say. In the case of Mr. Trump, it's the inaugural address. What he does is he has a full embrace of protectionism, talks about buying American, hiring American, and embraces the idea of protectionism and all that. He talks about the costs of foreign policy. And what I think is I wouldn't call him an isolationist, but I think there's large elements of retrenchment to what he does, because he basically thinks foreign policy is expensive and isn't worth it. And if we only had those resources to spend at home, things would be better. And the problem with this thinking is, again, what happens in the world doesn't stay there. So if the world unravels, we will pay an enormous price in terms of our own security and prosperity. So again, foreign policy, what we do for it is not an act of philanthropy, it's an act of self-interest. Second of all, what we spend on it is not enough to break the bank. Let's say 3.5% of GDP that we're spending on our foreign policy and defense policy now is much, much lower than our Cold War average. And we did just fine economically when we were spending considerably higher. Lastly, God knows we have all sorts of economic problems here at home and social problems. But I defy anyone to make the case that the 2007-8 financial crisis was caused by the Iraq War. I mean, the reason LaGuardia Airport is as lousy it is not because of what we did in Afghanistan. The reason we haven't tackled entitlements is not because of our commitments to Japan. So we can't blame what we're doing in foreign policy for our domestic failures. So again, we've got to continue to do foreign policy that makes sense, again, because we need a stable world for our own self-interest, and we've got to tackle our domestic problems. But to set it up, which I think the president did in the inaugural, as less guns, more butter, seems to me to get it wrong on both sides. But I think there is a doctrine there, which is America first, a more limited American role in the world, and a rejection of traditional American commitments to the world, including free trade. So I think that's the bias of this president, and I'm hoping that he comes to see that it will on balance work significantly against the interests of this country if it is pursued.
So the current headlines on General Flynn, Russia, the administration, suspicions about collusion possibly, although I haven't seen the proof, we haven't seen the proof of that yet. How damaging is this at the beginning of an administration as we begin to face all of these challenges?
It is damaging because it's a distraction, but to me, the thing that matters, we'll see where the Russian investigations go. Let's just put that in a box for a second. But we need a serious national security process. Again, if you got all these things coming at you, you've got to have a government that's prepared to deal with them. But right now, you have a Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense. Neither one has a deputy. Neither one has any assistant secretaries or undersecretaries. Neither one has a staff. At the White House, we don't have a national security advisor. We have a lot of people who now have roles in national security, including the chief strategist and others. So the lines of authority are totally uncertain. This can't go on. Again, if you have a world in disarray, you can't afford to have a government in disarray. The combination is toxic. You have a chance of dealing with the world in array if you have a government that's organized. And by the way, another thing, right now there's an entire generation of Republican foreign policy hands that normally would be staffing this government, people at the mid-level. They've all been excluded. Why? Because most of them opposed Donald Trump when he ran for president. Okay. I would say, in the immortal words of the former mayor of Washington, D.C., get over it. Donald Trump, if he's going to be a successful president, needs to turn to the best and brightest in this country and bring them in. So yes, they oppose him, but I don't care if these people are Democrats, Republicans, or whatever. If they are talented and they're prepared to work hard and loyally for this president, then I think we should say thank you if they're willing to go into government. And right now, we've excluded these people, so we don't have the staffing we need. We're not allowing cabinet members to choose their deputies. We don't have a national security advisor. All the crises this administration has thus far had to cope with are self-generated about things they said. This has got to be sorted out before there's a real crisis that hits us, and then the clock's ticking.
Well, I remember the early missteps of the Kennedy administration, right, which really, between the Bay of Pigs and the Vienna Conference, that went so badly, and it led to near war. We were lucky, or perhaps we had the right leadership at that point. My point is, I guess I'm just making this point that you're making, and that is that...
In that case, it's a really good point.
Because I'm worried about this, and I think that... But what I'm not... I watched the press conference today. I don't know if you were on a plane or not.
No, I caught a few minutes of it.
Well, that's all you needed to see. It was kind of like eating a bad apple. Just one bite of a bad apple, and you've had enough. It was all about, the media. I know I'm a member of the media, but it was all about all of these other things, and there doesn't seem to be yet a tackling of these problems. So first, before you're going to solve a problem, you need to recognize that you have one, and I don't see that process within the administration yet.
Well, I mean, the president, talked about. His argument was he inherited, quote unquote, a mess. And again, I think that badly overstates the domestic situation. I think he's actually inherited an economy that's improving, and a lot of the indices domestically are moving in the right direction. I think internationally it is a more daunting inheritance for the reasons we talked about at the beginning of this session. Again, he's got to get his house in order. And getting the house in order means organizationally and staffing. People, at some point, people become policy. So you've got to get the best people in. You've got to set systems up so the government is disciplined in how it goes about assessing options and implementing them. So again, I feel some urgency on this because again, the world won't sort itself out without the United States, but the United States has to sort itself out if it's going to be in a position to lead and act effectively in the world. Or to use a healthcare equivalent, there's the big debate with the Affordable Care Act about repeal and replace. And I think the general consensus is, there's many people who think that it's a grievous error to repeal without replace. Well, I'd say the same thing in foreign policy. We don't want to repeal large elements of American foreign policy that have, I think, for the most part, worked over the last 3/4 of a century without having a very good idea of what we've got to replace it with. And there's not yet an administration in the foreign policy sense. You don't have enough people there who are able to think about what would be a new set of policies. I'm skeptical they exist in many cases. But again, we've got to go about this carefully until this administration is up to speed. Even if you are up to speed, as Cliff said, history shows virtually every president and his administration make mistakes early on. You learn. You learn how to work with one another. This administration, you've got virtually no one at the top level who's ever served in the executive branch. None of them had, or very few of them had this kind of experience. So the propensity or possibility of making errors is probably higher than usual. So give yourself the best possible chance, which again is to come up with a formal system that is built on the most talented people you can find in this country.
Here's a great question. I have a feeling the premise of your answer would be different from the approach taken by President Trump, but so be it. The question is, with Brexit and the rise of nationalist parties across Europe, what can or should the U.S. do to help preserve a united Europe, especially in light of Putin's interference? Great question.
I think there's things we can do to help Europe on the security front. We talked about that with NATO. I don't think there's a whole lot we can do to determine the future of Europe on the political economic side. I think that's largely going to be for European governments, Germans, the French, the British, the Italians, for what happened, the relationship between Brussels and these governments. That's really going to be for the Europeans to sort out. They're going to have to manage their own publics. They're going to have to deal with issues like immigration, entitlements, the rules of trade, the role of government in the economy. I don't think, we have a big stake in it. And it's always uncomfortable in life when you have a big stake and your influence is not commensurate with your stake. But I actually think that's the case in Europe. The Europeans have dug themselves into a hole, a much longer conversation with how they've designed Europe, how they've operated it. I think the refugee issue really has poisoned the politics of Europe. But I don't think there's a whole lot the United States at this point can do. Probably the best thing we could do is help create conditions where there's no longer the refugee pressures going into Europe. That probably as much as anything would help.
Last question. Is there, if you can connect the dots, if this connection exists, the rise of the United Front, of the National Front in France, and also other nationalist movements in Europe, and our own election here? Because if they are connected, if there is something that's going on globally, then maybe we're not going to do anything about it. We're part of it.
I think there are some similarities, but I think, again, some of the vote in Britain really, more than anything else, the politics of Europe have been affected more than any other issue by the flow of refugees into Europe out of Syria. And then, again, it shows you two things. It shows you the consequences of inaction. What you don't do in policy can be every bit as significant as what you do. And second, it shows you that nothing's local. Here was something in Syria and the Middle East, and it has perhaps history-changing consequences for Europe. That's sobering stuff, but we ought to take those lessons to heart. I do think, though, here and there is the sense of a loss of economic opportunity, not as much upward mobility as there ought to be, wage stagnation. And to me, this argues, and we've talked about it a little bit before, particularly given automation and everything else, we had better improve education in this country, improve training, improve transitional economic assistance. We have got to retool our societies. If we're going to basically make it possible for a broad swath of citizens to cope with the pressures of living in this mono world. And if we don't do that successfully, then the kind of populism in this country and in Europe is only going to grow. And I think we also have to be honest with ourselves. Something's got to give, and we have to be willing to put on the political agenda things like entitlement reform and all that, or sooner rather than later we're going to have an enormous problem with our debt. So we've got to be honest with ourselves about what are the real challenges we face. We've got to have a grown-up conversation about the choices. And we do have to put in place a whole new set of policies in the education and training space and beyond to help people cope. Because no one's going to have, you can get the best quality education at Rice or any other university in America. There's no way when the education you've received by the time you're 22 is going to be enough to get you down the highway of life for the next 40 or 50 years. Zero chance. And not everyone's going to have that educational base. So we're going to have to basically think about an educational and training, not model, but models in the plural, where 5, 10, 15 times during your life, whether it's a community college, an online course, something offered by a corporation or employer, people are going to have to retool. And that's the way we're going to have to increasingly run our societies if we're going to cope.
Richard, you've given us a great roadmap. Thank you very much. It was fascinating discussion. Thank you. Great job.
Well, that brings us to the end of the show. Check out my website, vladdavidyak.com, and make sure to follow me on Twitter, @VladDavidyak. Tons of cool stuff there every single day. Please give the show a great rating and review on iTunes. It really helps other people find us when they're searching for a good show. Until the next time, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.